and welcome back to my channel. So today's video is all about the books that I read in 2021. So I thought that I would kind of set this up as a little bit more of a chatty video because looking inside my collection bullet journal is not super interesting. It's literally just the same tracker that I've been using for honestly about 6 years at this point. I will actually throw up some footage just so you can see. So I actually used the most pages that I ever have used for a reading tracker because I actually also read the most that I've ever read in a year since I've started tracking. I won't say ever in my life, but since I've started sort of diligently tracking what I've actually read, this is the most that I have read in a year. So I ended up using, I think, 5 pages, but I figured I would give you a little bit of a breakdown for my year and kind of talk about some things about my reading journey this year because it was a little bit of a weird one. So just so you know, I do actually have my collection bullet journal in my lap so I can kind of refer to things periodically. But yeah, let's start off with, I guess, the basic stats. So in 2021, my goal was to read 50 books. I wanted to read 5 books in French, 3 books in Spanish, 1 book in Italian, and then kind of the rest of the information that I ended up tracking. I don't actually set a goal for myself. It's just kind of, it is what it is. So I completed almost all of my sort of individual goals that I wanted to do. I did not complete 2 of them. So I still have not finished a book in Italian. I am technically in the middle of 2 different books. I've read 2 short stories out of 10 in one Agatha Christie book, and I've probably read the first 5 or 10 pages of a different book that's literally 60 pages long, and I just haven't gotten back to it. And honestly, it is on my list again this year. I think if I don't actually read a book in Italian this year, I might take it off of my just overall tracker and I'll revisit it later. I think part of that has to do with the fact that I am just not as comfortable reading in Italian by far. So I basically spent a lot of time working on my French reading skills when I kind of first came to France, probably the 2nd or 3rd year I was here, I started working on that. And then I have since kind of been working up to my Spanish reading skills. And I actually have spent the absolute most time working on my French reading skills, the next most time working on my Spanish reading skills, and then Italian is basically kind of a new thing. Now, the one upside with reading in Italian is that it does use a specific verb tense, a specific literary verb tense that I'm already familiar with thanks to French, which that was a fun little mental exercise to figure out. But the thing that I've noticed with Italian in particular is that I tend to understand a lot more if I read it aloud to myself, which is just not something I typically do. So yeah, that's one of the things I just really haven't gotten into a groove with reading in Italian, whereas with French and Spanish, I've kind of got a rhythm figured out, and so it's not that bad. So that one I didn't actually finish. The other one that I didn't actually finish is I only read 2 books in Spanish this year instead of 3, and I'm actually, my first book in 2022 is going to be my 3rd Spanish book from last year, but it's going to count as the first book from this year. And part of it is because the first 2 books that I read in Spanish, which let me see what those were. So the first book that I read in Spanish was actually Diary of Anne Frank, and that is by far the longest book I've ever read in Spanish. I think it was 400 or 500 pages. I can't remember exactly. And so that one just took me a while just because it was so long. What was nice about that one is I've already read the Diary of Anne Frank in English, and so I'm and obviously I'm also familiar with Anne Frank in general. And so that was one that was a really nice, it just it was physically a longer book, so it took me longer. The other one that I read was Como agua para chocolate, and that is one that I kind of stopped and came back to. I had a couple of periods of time this year where I was just super stressed, and typically when that happens, I stop reading in a foreign language before bed and I either do nothing or I do something else. And I think that one kind of hit at that point, and it also hit at the end of the year with the 3rd book that I'm reading, which is by far the shortest of the 3 that I was planning to read last year. It is actually the shortest one, and it's even a young adult book, and I started reading it. It was one that I sort of got gifted from a friend because she was moving, and I was oh great, that means I don't have to go and buy a book in Spanish. And honestly, I don't there's something about the story itself that just kind of rubs me the wrong way. But I'm trying to finish it, and so it's been really slow going. So I only finished 2 out of the 3 books. I did start a 3rd book, but I'm finishing it this year. Otherwise, I actually did hit all of my goals. So I read exactly 5 books in French. Last year I definitely read more in French, and I think I also read more in Spanish, but I also read more graphic novels and or manga, whereas this year I read more novels, and those just like take longer to get through. And so I hit my French goal, but like I didn't actually go past it. The one that I absolutely blew out of the water was my general reading goal. I set a goal of 50 books. And I know I basically always read more than 50 books. It's just a question of how much more. And this year I read 139 books. Now, the first thing is, out of all of these stats, I went through and I did a couple of stats. So before we kind of dive into the hows and the whys and all of that, a couple of stats are, I actually listened to 81 audiobooks out of that 139. So if you kind of subtract out the books I read in a foreign language, that was 7 books, 5 in French, 2 in Spanish. So that's at 132 of my books were in English. And out of that 132 books in English, 81 of them were audiobooks, which is over half. Like, I'm not going to do the math, but it's over half, right? It's probably closer to 2/3 of the books that I read. So that is something we're going to kind of chat about, but just like know that out of those books, a lot of those were audiobooks. And I did read 21 nonfiction books. Those are probably more skewed to audiobooks. I've been actually really getting into listening to nonfiction audiobooks. I find I have a much higher rate of actually finishing the book than if I want to like sit on the couch and do that. I tend to want to like sit on the couch and read stories as opposed to nonfiction stuff. I didn't actually check to see how many of my nonfiction books were audiobooks, but like given my stats, I would say like it's probably mostly audiobooks. And then out of all of the books that I read, only 4 of them were manga and or comic books. And I actually think that they were at least 3 of them. No, actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 3. 3 of them were in French because I was working on reading Death Note in French, and so I finished those. So I didn't actually read as much manga and as many manga and comic books this year. And that honestly, that's one of those things that kind of fluctuates year to year. I do enjoy reading manga and comic books, but because I haven't really figured out renting them from the library. Like, I don't know why my brain isn't like, oh, let's go like try and do that from the library. And so I only ever read comic books when I have them like physically, and I just don't always get my hands on them. So that's kind of why it wasn't any like kind of conscious decision. So out of all those books, like let's talk about the number. This year ended up being a little bit rougher, I think, in terms of just general pandemic life. And I noticed that I would have times where I was just like so stressed. So I know that in January, I read a ton. I also read quite a bit in October, I think, during my holidays, and again during my Christmas holidays. So I had at least 2 or 3 like kind of bursts where I read a lot. So actually, let me grab my bullet journal. So this is something I'll probably end up like snipping pieces out of this, so this won't take quite so long. But I figured I would go and tell you sort of what because I don't actually keep track in here, like how many books I read in a month. It's really just by the year. But because I have my monthly trackers, I can kind of tell you. And you can tell anytime that I have a huge spike in the number of books I read, that typically means that I'm very stressed. Like that's just my coping mechanism. And yeah, it is what it is. Like it's not the worst thing I could do to cope. It's not the best thing I could do to cope. It's just a thing I do to cope. So for January, let's see. January, I read 22 books. So I did have my Christmas holidays. It was, another Christmas that I was not able to go home and see my family. So that definitely had something to do with that. I read 8 books in February. So every single month I set a goal of reading 4. If I read 4 books a month, I hit my goal of 50 books. Most of the time I hit that. Every once in a while I don't. Most of the time I hit that. And I actually will sometimes have months where I'm very stressed and I don't read. And then I have months where I'm very stressed and I do read. And it just kind of depends what kind of stressed I am. So in March, wow, I wrote it in yellow and it's almost impossible to read. I read 7 books. In April, I read 7 as well. So 7's actually a pretty good number for me. Like a little bit more than 1 a week is pretty average. In May, we're up to May. May I read 6. June I read 17, so that was a little bit of a stressful time. I read 5 in July. That's honestly probably the month that was closest to when I was like on track with the goal I had actually set. In August, I read 27 books, so that was a high stress month. That was also the end of the summer holidays right before I went back to school. So, you know, the stress of going back to school and also like wanting to sort of take advantage, I guess, of having more free time. In September, I only read 4, so that's by far the lowest. I actually just hit my goal. So September is always very busy, so that honestly makes sense. In October, I read 7. Oh, I thought I had a spike in October. The spike was January, August, and December, I think is what it is. So in October, I only read 7. In November, I read 7. And then in December, I read 23. So I think January was 22, August was 27, and December was 23. And those were my 3 periods of like spiking. All the other months were much more normal. 7 was obviously like kind of that seems to be kind of my general average. So like if I dip below 7, it's kind of a different sort of stress. If I go way above 7, that's a different type. So when I say that I use reading to kind of deal with stressors, I actually kind of go in waves for how I deal with stress. So either I'm going to be reading, or I'm going to be listening to podcasts, or I'm going to focus on TV. It just kind of depends. Like sometimes my brain wants absolute silence and to be completely in my head, and so I'm going to read ebooks. Sometimes I want to have noise to like kind of cancel out whatever I'm trying to like keep my mind off of, and I'm gonna go for more TV or podcasts. Typically, if I go for podcasts or audiobooks, that's actually when I'm in sort of a better mental state, because typically when I listen to audiobooks and podcasts, that means I'm also doing something else at the same time. I'm, you know, doing housework, or I'm sewing, or I'm going for walks, or whatever. So it is like, this is kind of one of my ways of dealing with stress. And because I read so many books, there are kind of 2 key things to take away from this. The one is I had some times where I was very, very stressed and kind of lost myself in books, and that was where I had sort of a spike in reading ebooks. And on the months that I read over 20 books, it was pretty split. I know at least one of the times it was like maybe 2/3 ebooks and 1/3 audiobooks, and some of them are a little bit more half and half. Otherwise, my general usage is I might go months where I only listen to, or I only read 1 or 2 ebooks, and then the majority of my reading comes in the form of audiobooks, because I'm also sewing, I'm also going for long walks in the summer, I'm also like, you know, doing cooking stuff, and you know, it just sort of depends what's going on. So reading 139 books in the year for me is a personal best, but it is also not necessarily a good thing, because that means that I was honestly not able to handle certain types of stress throughout the year, and they kind of got the better of me. And then when I shut down, like that's typically what happens, is I end up reading. So that is actually one of my goals for this year. I actually, because I have a fair number of hobbies that I can listen to audiobooks with, I think that over the next couple of years, I will probably break some of my previous reading goals. So previously I would read about 80 books a year. Like that was kind of a pretty good like average for me. This is the first time I've ever broken 100, and this is the first time I've ever broken 100 by this much. And so I think that just like my general audiobook consumption is going to mean that my like base number is going to swing higher than it usually would, just because I have this thing that I do when I'm doing other stuff. But I do want to try and work harder on managing my stress a little bit better. So, you know, part of the way that I'm doing that is I'm doing my no work weekends. Part of the ways that I'm doing that is I am trying to, you know, make sure I'm making time for some social activities. Like I have some standing online dates with some friends. I've got some standing kind of in-person things that I try and do with friends, like trying to do that, because honestly, I read too much this year. I read a little bit too much this year. So some other stats I kind of wanted to talk about is, so some of the books, I actually read more sort of standalone epilogues than I ever have, and that honestly probably accounted for at least a dozen of the books that I read were specific like add-on things. So either short story novella format that on Goodreads are counted as a separate book. So if you were to take those out, I probably read actually closer to like 120 full books, but it's 139 when you add in all of the other little things that I read, which I do count them, but I do like kind of take that number with a grain of salt. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's just kind of a number, it's just information for me to have. So one of the things that I really, so this is another way for me to kind of know if stress is getting out of hand for me. And honestly, I wasn't originally planning on having this particular like yearly wrap up of my reading being how I deal with stress, but honestly, that is what it is. So going with that, one of the things that I notice as well is if I start getting very stressed, I tend to reread a lot of books. And I actually reread a ton of books this year. I reread like favorites from previous years. I reread favorites that I had just recently discovered. I actually had one series that I think I finished reading the series in January of 2020, like January of this year. And by the end of December, I was like rereading the first books again. So like, you know, within a year kind of thing. And that is typically a sign. Sometimes I do it if I'm in like, sometimes if I'm in like a really good place and I just like have this story that I really, really love that I want to reread, I will do that. But I also kind of more frequently will do like massive amounts of rereading if I'm very stressed, because there's stories that I know I'm going to like, and I know what the conflict is going to be, and I know whether it's something that I can like mentally handle at that moment. So I did do a fair bit of rereading. And so if like on my reading log, I actually will have like huge chunks of books that are just like all by the same author. So at the beginning of the year, that was when Bridgerton came out. So I was rereading a bunch of Julia Quinn, because I had actually read Julia Quinn way back when. Like I've been rereading her for like years. And so I ended up rereading all the Bridgerton books and finishing them up, because the last time that I had read them, I think the last like 2/3 books like weren't out at that point, and so I finally like finished the entire series. And that is one where there's the second epilogue that she's added on, that on Goodreads is a separate it's a separate thing, but most of them are like under 30 pages, I think. So that was one that I read a bunch of. I also had a couple of other authors that I frequently, if I find an author that I really like, I will go through it and I will just like read as many of their books as I can. And I had a couple of authors that I started doing that this year. I have a couple that I'm still working on. I have a couple I want to go back to, and I have a couple that I've like almost completely read. So out of like the authors that I sort of found either last year, like at the end of last year, or this year, that I've been like systematically reading their books, one is Scarlett Peckham. She does not have very many books out at this point. I think she's got like, it's like 6 or 7, and I think I've read just about all of them. She's also got a couple of things through like her newsletter / her website where you can get some like extra epilogues or short stories, which is really cool. The one that actually got me like into reading her is actually called the Rakess. And I will try and link all the names of the books I specifically call out. Otherwise, I do leave my Goodreads profile. If you want to go, I track everything that I read, book stuff that I read on Goodreads. So if you're interested, it's pretty, like it's private and then I have to accept you, but it's pretty public. So if you're interested in seeing what I've read so you can add them to your to read list, you can check out the link down below. But so the book that got me into reading this particular author, Scarlett Peckham, is called The Rakess, and I'm actually waiting on book 2. So basically I read the first book and was like, there's no second book for like another year or so. So I went back and I read all of her other stuff. I really enjoy her. She does like historical fiction. It's very feminist. It's a little bit like more alternative than some other historical romance authors that I have previously read, which that's definitely going to be sort of like a key, like a common thread through all of these authors that I'm going to talk about. So she is one. The other one that I have been systematically reading through is KJ Charles. I'm pretty sure I talked about her last year. Love all of her books. I am working on reading through all of them. I think I've still got, I don't know, maybe like between 5 and 10 left. I've read a fair number of them. I've actually reread, so she's one that I've actually reread some of my favorite trilogies that I really, really enjoy. I would say my absolute favorite that I like have already reread, and this was the one that like kind of started my reread. So the first book that I ever read by hers, and like I definitely have this where the first book that I read of a trilogy or of an author sometimes will be my favorite one kind of throughout time. My absolute favorite one in the first trilogy is An Unseen Attraction. I really enjoyed that entire trilogy, but the first book, I really, really love the characters. But honestly, I haven't read any of her books that I don't like. She's got a fair number of like kind of full-length novels, and then she's got a couple that are more like novella style. Definitely worth checking out. So her books tend to feature LGBTQIA characters as well as characters of color, and have just like really like she goes into things like mental illness and like just neurodivergent characters, and like she's got like a really well-rounded like cast of characters, and her stories are just like so heartwarming. I definitely recommend, if that is like any sort of like historical romance, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, check out KJ Charles. The other one that I have found kind of more recently is Cat Sebastian, and she's kind of in the same vein. So her characters are also almost all, if not all, LGBTQIA. They are also historical romance. There are a couple characters of color, but it's not as big of a focus as you would get with someone like KJ Charles. But I do really enjoy her stories as well. So out of all of Cat Sebastian's stories, the one that I like the most, and again, I like all of her stories so far, but the one that I like the most is Unmasked by the Rakess. So if that is a place that you want to start, it also is the first book in a trilogy. Again, I told you a lot of times I like the first book in a trilogy that I read, but I actually really do enjoy this story a lot. The other author that I've been systematically reading through is Talia Hibbert, and hers are definitely more modern. So like contemporary romances, and I love her stories. She has a ton of neurodivergent as well as characters of color, and like they're just amazing. I'm trying to think, so she's got a couple of different trilogies, and there are a few that I really like. So I will say out of, all right, hold on, I have to find them, because you'd think I would have like written these down, but like no, I'm just going off the top of my head because I don't plan things. You'd think I would because I'm a planner, but anyway. So one that I really love is Work For It. I'm gonna give you like three because there are three very different trilogies, and I have like favorites out of all of them, so you know. So one of them is it's actually the last book in, I think it's actually a quartet as opposed to a trilogy. It's the last book, and it's my favorite out of all of them. All the other ones are really good, but this is my favorite, is Work For It. So from a different trilogy that I really like, and this is actually the first one, I really love Get a Life, Chloe Brown. I actually like all three of these a lot. My favorites are definitely the first two, I would say, but I like all three of them a lot. So the first one is actually Get a Life, Chloe Brown. And then the third one, which is a completely different trilogy, is A Girl Like Her. I really like. So all three of those, if you're interested in trying out Talia Hibbert, those would be like my top three to go with. Like you can't go wrong with any of them. They're all so good. So I'm actually working on reading more of hers. I think I've probably got like 5 or 6 of her books left, and I think I'm out of almost all of the trilogies, and I'm down to just kind of like standalone, and or I think there might be one duology in there, but yes, love hers. So the other author that I started reading through a bunch of hers, and I think I've read like 2 of her trilogies at this point, or no, I think I read one of her series, and there was like 4 or 5 books in that one, and then I started the first book that I want to go back to is Jeannie Lynn, and hers are really cool because they are like historical romance set in the Tang Dynasty, which I had never really encountered any like historical romances that were really outside of England, basically. So I really enjoy hers because I love reading about how life was lived in different cultures at different times, and hers, I really like her writing style a lot. Like even though with all of these, even though they are historical romance, you'll definitely notice kind of a theme in the authors that I tend to read, and so even when I'm reading historical romances, I tend to gravitate towards authors that have more modern values, and their stories just happen to be set in historical times, and you get some of that like the flavor of that time period while still like maintaining some of the things that we expect as, you know, modern women. So yeah, so those are definitely some of the authors that I have really been enjoying this year. I'm trying to think of all of the nonfiction books I read, like the ones that I would like go back and reread or that I would really recommend. Let me cogitate on that. So I think if I have to pick only 2, because I actually I tend to sort of read different like sort of subject matter in chunks, and I had a couple of other things that I read, but I think if I had to pick only 2 books that I read this year, that'd be like, these would be cool books that I think most people would find interesting. One is Tiny Habits, and I did a separate video on this one, so like kind of makes sense that that one makes the cut. I really enjoyed that. I at some point need to make a video to do an update, but I honestly am still maintaining the Tiny Habits that I set. So if you saw that Tiny Habits video, I am actually still doing those, and it is now January, mid-January, and I started them in August, I think. So like honestly, it's been going really well. I like the way that the information is set up. I've read a number of books on like habit tracking and setting up habits and making and breaking habits and like all that kind of stuff, and this is the one that I honestly find to be the clearest. So that is definitely one that I would recommend. The other one that is honestly just like chicken sold to my linguist's heart is because internet. And that one goes into the way that like internet has changed the way that we use language, and like just the fact that for the first time in essentially human history, we actually have written informal language, because it was never needed before, because typically like you wouldn't use paper to write stuff or whatever, but now we have tweets and we have texting, we have all this stuff, and like there's this entire set of informal English and other languages, but this focuses mostly on English. So there's this entire like set of informal English that exists basically because of the internet, and that has like things that existed only on the internet have now like sort of moved over into spoken English, and like there are things that we do in spoken English that have made their way into internet, like, you know, written informal English. And it's like, it's super, super fascinating. I know I'm a huge language nerd, like I get that, but like honestly, it's amazing. I probably shouldn't be that excited about a book about informal English, but I really am. So those are probably the two books that I really, really liked. Now, this is just like a subset, obviously, of all the books that I read, but I think my biggest takeaways from this year are, one, audiobooks and I are in a mad love affair that is not going to be ending anytime soon. Honestly, it has like changed my productivity, because I will sometimes have times where like I want to work on stuff, but I also want to listen to stories. And so previously be like, okay, well, if I'm listening, like if I'm reading an audiobook, I can only do that. Or if I'm watching TV, like I am not the kind of person that just like puts TV on in the background. I end up pausing it. Like I either end up sitting and watching TV, or I end up pausing it and doing something different. And so audiobooks and podcasts to a certain extent have like honestly made it so that I can have my stories and still do stuff, and like game changer. The second thing is that I definitely need to work on how I deal with stress. There are definitely going to be times where I don't necessarily have control over that, because there are going to be stressful situations that I just kind of have to like get through and do my best. I'm still working on that one. That, you know, that one is still work in progress. I think that one of the good things is that I'm getting better about recognizing like my stress triggers and like how I react to too much stress. Like just the fact that I know that I have sort of like when I shut down from stress, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm sitting on the couch not doing anything. It usually means that I'm sitting on the couch and I am like only going through TV, or I'm only reading books, and then like I have another one that is like scrolling on the internet, and that's the one where like I can't do anything, I just need like random stimulus. So just like being able to identify that I think is a first step, but the next step is going to be like, you know, having my stress like binge reads or stress TV watching things are a healthier way to cope than I could. Like there are other worse ways to do it, but like I would love to get to a point where I can manage my stress a little bit more, that it's not like a thing that happens 2 or 3 times a year, you know what I mean? And again, I don't quite know how that's going to happen. I am, you know, trying different things, and it is getting a little bit better, but this year was a bit rough. Pandemic times, you know what I mean? Like it is what it is. So I think everybody probably had that to some extent, and there's not necessarily anything we can do about that. Like I can't just magically make pandemic stress go away. Like that's not in my power. So you know, the other thing is, if you're interested in reading more as part of your daily life, it is definitely possible. I will say that I do not, barring certain stress periods, I do not just like sit on my couch and read all day, every day, and that's how I read this much. I have managed to work reading into my schedule and into my daily life in other ways. So I've definitely mentioned these before, but I'll mention them again. I feel like it's probably a good idea to recap this sort of every year, just because I can't expect you all to go back and watch previous videos. So one of the ways that I do it is I like to read in foreign languages. It's a way that I kind of maintain some of the languages that I speak, and that I also have sort of a certain level of reading comprehension in. And so the way that I do that is I read for anywhere between 5 and 20 minutes before I go to bed. I try to do it most nights. There are definitely some times where I sort of fall off the wagon, but it is something that I always come back to. So reading a little bit before bed, I personally have chosen to do that as foreign language reading, but you could definitely just do that in your native language and like work in 5 to 20 minutes of reading before bed just kind of in general. I also typically have some kind of audiobook going or podcast, and I kind of rotate through this, but I do typically have some kind of an audiobook that I am working on for when I'm doing things around the house. So when I'm batch cooking, I don't follow recipes typically when I batch cook, and so I can just put an audiobook on and do it sort of on autopilot. I also do it when I'm cleaning, a lot of times when I am sewing, especially if I'm working on a pattern that I know pretty well, and I'm just sort of doing like self-care sewing as opposed to like I'm learning a new skill sewing, two different things. If I'm working on something like a self-care sewing, it's a pattern that I know, I don't like, I can check in on the directions, but I don't have to like super concentrate on it. A lot of times I have an audiobook going. A lot of times in the summer I will go for walks around town and I listen to audiobooks. I'm actually currently in a kick right now where I'm not really listening to anything as I'm walking to and from work. I just am like listening to city sounds, and I go through phases with that as well, but that's kind of where I get in my audiobooks. And then I do typically have a couple of ebooks going on, and that tends to be where I am the least consistent, just because that requires me to sit on my couch and like not really do anything else. And so I will have times where I want just to read and I put on like an ASMR room in the background and I just kind of like zone out, get in my head. And then there are other times where I want to have the sound and I'm going to watch something on like TV or whatever. But it is something that I know I'm always going to have some kind of a book going, usually 2 books going at any given time. If I have a foreign language book, an audiobook, and an ebook going, it's at least 3 books going. But like there are like most days I read something. Like that is just part of my daily life, and that's how I make the time to read as much as I do. So I think that is it for the 2021 reading roundup. I hope you got some ideas for some things to read if you happen to like reading the same sorts of things that I do. If you're interested in seeing all 139 books and or previous books from previous years, I will leave my Goodreads profile down below. So you can follow me on Goodreads. I don't even know what they call it on Goodreads, but you can like access my profile, I guess, if you will, and get some ideas for other books. I also find things from, when stuff comes up on my feed, I get sort of ideas for different books to read. To be perfectly honest, I always have books that I need to read, but I do get ideas for new books that I hadn't heard of. So other than that, I hope that you're having a good year so far. Since this was a kind of year wrap up, we'll say Happy New Year, and I will see you in my next video. Bye. Hey guys, so if you've made it all the way to the end of this video and are actually watching my end screen and you're not subscribed to my channel, I would really appreciate it if you would. There's a little button right there for you to do it. And if you're interested in watching some more of my videos, I have links to 2 of my older videos off to the left there, so you can check those out if you would like to, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.